Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Global Scholar Series. I am also delighted to greet our speaker, Dr. Joshua Rickard from Japan, to launch the first talk of the series. Let me also welcome Let me also welcome our Assistant Provost for Global Engagement, Dr. Wing Kai To, who is here joining us. I really appreciate that. And also my students from Anthropology of the Middle East, Anthropology 216, who let me open the class to the campus community. Hopefully we will have more people, but before introducing our speaker, I have two announcements to make, short announcements. One of them is about the series, and let me share my screen here. And let me also share the flyer for the series. Most of you have seen the flyer, but I want to let you know that the series will continue throughout the semester. We have 11 scholars, with the exception of my dear friend, Matthew Weiss. All of them are based overseas. And you can easily click on the registration link, register, and attend. Also, there is a link here at the bottom of the page. I will share this in the chat. It lets you go to the Middle East and North African Studies webpage, or in addition to exploring the grants and courses we have, the conference that we have, you can find more about each talk. For example, for today, you can learn that Dr. Rickard book is coming out, and you can learn more about the research that he has been doing. Now that we are here, let me also share with you a course that we are developing with my colleague who is here, Dr. Fyodor Gushev, and two other colleagues from Political Science Department, Dr. Kushi, Sidita Kushi, and Rachel Navarre. We are developing a migration studies program, and this is the introductory course to that program. The program is not registered yet, but if you take this course, there are many requirements that it fulfills. And it's an interdisciplinary approach to migration. You learn to study migration or see migration through the anthropological lens, sociological lens, economic lens, and so on and so forth. Let me stop sharing now and introduce my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Joshua Rickard, who is a social anthropologist and currently an associate professor at Kumamoto University in Japan. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the National University of Singapore, and that's where we met. Where was it? When was it? 2013, I believe.
2013, yes.
And he holds a PhD from the University of Kent. Dr. Rickard has been working in Palestinian communities since 2007, and his book, The Fragmentation of Palestine, is out as of next week, I believe, published by I.B. Torres. He is going to talk to us about shifting social organization in Palestinian communities amid the pandemic. This talk has been sponsored by MENA Global Programs, the Department of Anthropology, and the School of Social Work, and supported by the Department of Education. We are using the grant that we have from them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rickard. And thank you so much for accepting to give this talk, because it's 11:30 in Japan, and you see that he has his coffee maker behind his back.
Yeah, kettle, which is keeping it warm in the room.
Oh, nice. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I will go ahead and share my screen. So what I and can I ask, can you see the slide all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So my interest in the last couple years has been how the pandemic has affected specifically the communities that I've been working in since the last 15 years, really. And I'll get into talking about that or talking about how I've been trying to follow that up about halfway through the talk, because I think that's probably going to be more interesting for sharing ideas about anthropological methodology in the Q&A. So thank you again very much for inviting me and for giving me the chance to share with a different audience. So as Dr. Fawzi had mentioned, I've been working in Palestinian communities since 2007, although I've been based in Japan since 2015, and just stuck a slide up here to show my email address. I can show that again at the end of the talk to discuss more. And basically, because I was informed that the backgrounds of the audience might be slightly mixed, so I'm prepared to talk some about the historical social context, which I think is probably uh, obvious for many of us. Maybe it's a little bit helpful for just showing the groundwork of the situation place where I'm talking about for others. So I'm going to try to go through that quite quickly, but any points we can come back to. I'm happy to talk during the Q&A. And then look at what I've been researching, which is different forms of social organization that have emerged in Palestinian communities and how those have changed during different periods of time. Also, more my own interest is in the perception of community, what community is, how that changes, how that's been affected or not necessarily only affected by the pandemic, but how some changes have actually been pushed forward due to the situation uh, that have surrounded the pandemic as well. So just looking at, as I mentioned, the basic background. So I've been working primarily in the Northern West Bank since 2007, off and on during different periods of time. Although I've been working in different communities throughout the region, in Israel, in the Palestinian areas, and with some different communities in some of the surrounding countries as well. And so one of the main points in talking about background that I am going to make is the fact that the Palestinian population, when we talk about Palestinians as a community, they're very dispersed and in different situations. So one of my interests is how people imagine a cohesive community in these different situations and some of the difficulties, some of the problems that have emerged politically, especially in really the community being a very politicized one. So, and while I'm going to start talking about the differences between some of the communities, how people are divided from each other, because the divisions and what I call isolation, which I'll explain in a little bit, is really, for me, a major research interest. The primary place where I've always been going back to is the city of Nablus. And I'll also explain in a little bit why Nablus became the place where I, as an anthropologist, or in some ways the place that made me want to study anthropology more, always brought me back to. So a very historical city, very long history of trade for olive oil soap and other olive oil products. Also kanafa, which is incredibly sweet cheese pastry dessert, incredible amount of sugar in it, but very delicious and very famous in this town. And those aren't necessarily relevant, but just some snapshots from my last trip in 2020. Very good cuisine, as I think anyone who's been to the Middle East knows. So, as I mentioned, I'll just to go over some of the very general history for those who might not have as much of a background. And I don't know how necessary this will be for most of the participants. But if we go back really just over 100 years, and I'm going to try to go through 100 years in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So we can recap on any points during the Q&A, of course. But the area known as Israel, Palestine, and any of these nation states today, Syria or Iraq or Jordan, were part of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, there's very deep, rich histories, many different types of people living in this area, and long histories of trade, and many empires, kingdoms, states throughout this region, throughout history. One of the points, though, that I want to make just by looking at and talking about history when we think about change is that this is really right after World War I, and then for a very short time from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, when these areas were divided up between the French and the British to create smaller areas that would be easier to control. This is really when we draw up the borders that we have today, and also people start to think differently about the idea of nation state, the idea of passports, coherent citizenship, in slightly different ways that weren't the same as before. So that's also looking at how identity through labeling is changed by, in this case, political issues, and how that really not so long ago in history, there were very different ideas, maybe among the communities living through these regions. And what I'll come back to is, interestingly, this is something that's being re-articulated, re-talked about in the Middle East today because of different changes. So the British mandate Palestine, which again, only for a very short time of history, from the end of World War I until the end of the Second World War, ended in 1948 with the Declaration of Israeli Independence. And this is really just to show a date. There's a lot of other material to go over and talk about the formation of the State of Israel, which we can talk about later if that's necessary. But my main point is to draw historically when the idea of Palestinians as political residents dispersed through different parts of the Middle East became an issue. And this is, it's generally accepted that around 750,000 Palestinians became refugees in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and the areas of the West Bank and Gaza. And in 1948, Jordan, also these are all young countries at the time, Jordan took control of the West Bank and Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip until 1967. And within 20 years, Israel becomes a much more strong, powerful country in the region. And the Six-Day War is when Israel takes control of these areas, the West Bank, Syrian Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and the Egyptian Sinai, which is eventually given back to Egypt in peace still. But again, I'm really going through this just to show the different political changes that take place during these significant years. There's a lot more history in this between these years, of course, as well. But one of the points that I'm interested in making here, and I think you have a speaker in a couple weeks who's going to talk about this more. So my interest is really just in illustrating how the Palestinian community has been dispersed in different areas. There's today estimated around 13 million Palestinians in different places throughout the world, as well as in the United States and in Japan. Although when people talk about refugees, refugee is a political and legal term. That's only referring to those who are registered in refugee camps, mostly in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and some in the West Bank and Gaza as well. Again, refugees is not my primary interest here. I'm just illustrating how during different periods of time, different communities have been made in different areas, and also socially, how these different communities have over time, even within a small area, such as the city of Nablus, which contains 3 refugee camps, how those neighborhoods become really their own kind of closed communities in terms of exhibiting their own forms of identities, their own economies, and their own community modes of social organization. And I'll try to move through some of the historical facts just quickly. As I mentioned, this is more or less for those with less of a background, and also to illustrate how we're talking about distinctly different communities and people in distinctly different situations. So looking at what I call social organization, how people imagine themselves, and also how people organize themselves within communities, and how that's changed over time. When we look at Palestinian society, we're looking at people who are dispersed, some of them living in refugee camps, in diaspora, also what are called the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza. And in Israel as well, about 20% of the Israeli population is citizens of Israel are also Palestinian descendants. So there's distinctly different groups of people living in different places in very different situations. In the 1960s and 70s, and this is, I think, what kind of classically becomes known as the more politicized idea of a Palestinian identity. You see political movements, different political parties, different movements with various ideologies, and then the kind of umbrella organization, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, emerge as sort of representation for Palestinians without a state, without an actual government apparatus. And what's interesting about this period, and what I think one of the big changes that I want to illustrate has been, is that at this point in time, this was based in refugee camps, primarily in Jordan, in Lebanon, outside of what are considered the Palestinian territories. Although this had huge influence, and this really illustrates the development of uniquely politicized identities in the absence of government or recognized country. And that's one of the primary points, is that during these times, the political movements became very strong sources of local community organization. And there, in various communities, are different reasons for this. Some of these movements were, especially in the 1970s and 80s, affiliated with the Soviet Union, with the ones that were communist in nature. Others had different forms of funding, different forms of support from around the world. But what's unique here is that they became strong sources of local community identity in different villages, in different areas. And so on a very grassroots level, these types of political movements during this time were actually making many changes. And this leads into a period known as the First Intifada, which happened in 1987 to 1993. I think it's an important point as well to note another major difference between the diaspora, Palestinians living in refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, as opposed to those living in the West Bank and Gaza in the years following 1967, is that the border between Israel and the West Bank, Gaza, after 1967, of course, was drawn as a line on a map, but it became quite ambiguous at that point. And there actually were very high levels of integration, and Palestinians going to work in Israeli construction sites, Israeli factories. Of course, with the lack of economy in the West Bank or Gaza, they could make much more money doing that. And also in Israel, the economy grew exponentially during this period of time. So this was an interesting situation, that you have two different populations which are start to move more and more and integrate more and more in certain ways, but officially staying or being seen as separately. And by the end of the 1980s, what became known as the First Intifada, which was really, I think, internationally and in media, seen as really the paramount of these political movements organizing people in the Palestinian communities, became not only a kind of a period of violence, but also a period where the communities in the West Bank and Gaza were more or less managing themselves in a kind of grassroots type of way through different committees, through setting up independent local education, through setting up co-ops and things like that. And this ended with the Oslo Accords, which is an agreement mediated by the United States, which was signed in 1993 and 1995. And the idea, the kind of American-sponsored idea here was of a two-state solution to create a Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority. Originally, this was supposed to be a 5-year plan until a government could be established, but it's fairly well accepted more than 30 years later that that's not the direction that things have been going or that things are likely to go in the near future. But this type of agreement was really a direct result of the momentum of these types of grassroots movements, which at the time were attached to different political parties. So some of the changes that happened in the 1990s after the signing of the Oslo Accords, and again, my own interest is not really in the political background, which I'm trying to move through fairly quickly now. But my own interest, which I want to talk more about, is really what social changes mean in local communities and how things change on a local level. In the 1990s, though, you see a shift away from community organizing, sustainability, to institution building, creating ministries, applying for grants. And the main characteristic of the Palestinian Authority in the 1990s and still today is that there's no economy that sustains it the way most countries function. It's based on donor aid and applying to external sources like the United States, for example, for projects for aid. So this is very different. There's a formation of a government kind of apparatus and internationally political support for this. But at the same time, there's not a coherent country, and the populations are living dispersed in different situations in different places. So with the formation of the PA, this also brought in a lot of the political leaders from outside, which were then in turn seen as being elite, corrupt. And this also brought the political language and emphasis on specifically the Palestinian territories on the West Bank and Gaza, creating a sense of abandonment and neglect among the refugee populations outside. So increased class division, of course, a lot of money is coming in and certain people are getting jobs, getting grants, but actually throughout this time, and as Dr. Fawzi might remember, one of the things that in Singapore I was studying was development, or how development wasn't working in these areas because there's billions of dollars going into this, but at the same time, issues of poverty and even food insecurity were becoming major problems in a lot of Palestinian villages. And so this also led to a second uprising known as the Second Intifada in 2000. And so really with just kind of a very short period of optimism in the 90s, the situation of Palestinians, at least in the Palestinian territories, became quite chaotic and very uncertain. And these are just some statistics of the Palestinian territories. Approximately 3 million in the West Bank, approximately 2 million in Gaza. The PA government in the West Bank, which again, it's like a government apparatus without a country, and then the Islamist movement Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And really either of them, their ability to govern is quite limited. Before 2000, these movements such as Hamas were not really seen as serious political forces. And while they control area and have some power, they're also among the general population. What I'll talk about a little bit later is that all of the political leadership is basically losing legitimacy among most of the population today. So difficulties in everyday life, of course, access to education, medical facilities, disconnect between communities. And this is one of the things that I was more interested in studying, not these issues of everyday life themselves, but how people find ways to get around these types of problems and how people imagine their lives and imagine their worlds. So talking more about social organization during the kind of post-2000s period, communities become isolated from each other through siege. So in the case of the West Bank, villages, many of the villages in the areas that I was working in, people couldn't move out of them or between them for up to 10 years. And for a younger population, that makes a big impact on how people imagine their community, how people imagine other communities as well. So physically disconnect between territories. Also, later on in 2009, 2010, some projects of the PA to try to create economic stimulants by giving loans to people created many problems of debt among the population. So really after 2000s, after 2006 and 7 especially, you see the political parties which used to in the 1970s, 1980s have a big impact in communities, and in terms of also some idea of legitimacy of speaking for people or defining people, they lose influence in people's lives. And on a community level, in terms of organizing pre-existing structures, clan, family, take priority. This is not something unique also only in this situation. The anthropologist Haider al-Muhammad had written a lot about southern Iraq, Basra, and how when the country falls apart, when everything is destroyed and there's no law, people rely on pre-existing structures such as tribe, which maybe in modernity really didn't matter so much to people, but they become something almost like car insurance in terms of the way that people look at them and use them for negotiating life. So also during this period, and some of the things that I've been very interested in writing about is how people who, especially people who are stuck in different areas, imagine social identity differently in different ways, and relations between the different communities, how that becomes more distant with people living in very different situations. So these are some of the more political issues and questions that are always coming up again in media. But my own personal interest more and the kind of questions that I've been asking are how people make sense of their lives in uncertain and changing situations. So for me, uncertainty, not knowing what will happen, but finding ways to cope with that is a very big interest. Also, this idea of isolation, what this means to people who are severed from their larger community, what it means to be stuck, and how people express that, and how that's also dealt with in different communities in different ways. And there's a lot of different examples. I'll mention some later. Also, how people re-articulate the meaning of community, the meaning of identity through shared narrative and experience, and how in various communities, villages, neighborhoods, camps, how these differ from one another and how that changes in different situations. So for me, most of my observations, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, are based in the Nablus region. And there's several reasons for that. One of them is it was the first place that I happened to live in Palestinian areas. And I was able to go there at a very interesting time the first time and became quite close with people, and that brought me maybe more solidly into anthropology because I was fascinated with how people survived and got by. But the conditions of isolation were quite unique, especially between 2000 and 2009. On different levels, different neighborhoods, different villages were cut off from one another over long periods of time. And still some, even although there may be mobility is restored, at least much differently than it was at that time. It's affected the ways that different communities really communicate and function. So you have distinct local ideas of what it means to make a community, and also distinctly different what community modes of social organization, of dealing with different issues. Also, Nablus traditionally is one of seen as a relatively conservative society, and this is something which was increased during years of isolation, during years of tension. The city, neighborhoods, families became quite famous for becoming more closed, and this is something which is both limiting and enabling. Of course, if people know everything that's going on within a neighborhood, they know who's doing what and each other's business, then it's easier to ascertain who needs help, who needs food, who needs equipment. So very closely knit for being able to help each other. At the same time, it became a very toxic source of internal conflicts because of simple things which you can imagine, such as gossip and rumors and a lack of privacy. So these problems that the area faced were also quite interesting and produced some different problems and different issues. So moving on to the current pandemic. So I had visited Nablus last, and actually I was very fortunate that I didn't realize at the time how fortunate I would be. In February 2020, I believe Israel closed their border about 2 days after I left, with the initial outbreak of the pandemic. So limited movement of people, restrictions, as in many countries around the world, on work. Also, different antagonism. And this is not only from the different policies such as settlement expansion, which increased exponentially since 2020 in the Nablus area especially, but also antagonism from the Palestinian Authority, from the different elites within municipalities and local governments. So this became a very difficult situation on top of changing political situation, more stress on local communities. And then, as in many places around the world, limitations on medical facilities, vaccines were very slow to roll out among the Palestinian population. When I talked to people, I heard many stories of lack of ventilators and doctors needing to make the decision to take old people off of ventilators to make room for young people. That this type of thing is not only unique to Palestinian society, but it illustrates some of the difficulties which were happening. And my own interest was to try to trace how things were changing in the lives of the people who I know there. and to also get a larger idea of how this was influencing the other things that were already going on in the background. So I'll leave this for the Q&A because I'm interested in getting other people's opinions of this idea of remote ethnography. More actually of a struggle for me personally than the borders of Israel and the restrictions on movement of Palestinians since the COVID-19 pandemic, is that for me being based in Japan, it's also been quite strict because the country has been sealed off here. So if I leave, I can't get back. At the same time, I've been very interested to follow along with the people who I've been working with in this area for years. So I suspect, like many of you and many field workers, you're trying to keep in touch and trying to use technology as we are now to really follow and understand things that are happening. Of course, this creates the methodological problem of the limitation of participant observation, which for myself, I'm finding more that it's something I took for granted, that of course, having familiarity with the field, with the people, it's easier to imagine what is going on when you're talking with people, but not being able to be there and experience it oneself is something I found limiting in the last year. And one of the reasons that I wanted to follow along with the social problems created by the pandemic, of course, is that there are very high infection rates among the Palestinian population, and there's different reasons for that. In, of course, places like refugee camps, it's impossible to social distance. In other places, people can isolate certain family members, but then that also becomes a problem. So what struck me personally, and we're well over 2 years into the pandemic now, but what struck me very personally was within 6 months of February 2020, of the last time I visited there, literally everyone who I personally knew had COVID or had it. It spread very, very quickly through the population. And when talking with people, most of what people discuss are loss of jobs, loss of income because of restrictions, things that we can imagine almost anywhere in the world. But for me, one of the things that I find the most serious as an actual outcome of the pandemic has been the isolation of elderly. And of course, not all families have the luxury to isolate their parents, but for many people, this was and has been really an ongoing struggle with mental, psychological health. If any of you know about Arab society, families are very, very closely knit. People tend to hug and touch each other a lot and such. But in situations, especially of uncertainty, of not really knowing what's going to happen next, and especially in the communities where I was working, family and really family members interacting on a daily basis was the one certainty and the foundation of life for many people. So this issue on a psychological level really has much more than high infection rates and high rates of death been a big change because of the pandemic. It's really impacted people on a very personal level. And also economic inequality, which is not anything new, but it's was very clearly illustrated by the pandemic on a larger level. So, and of course, I'm discussing mostly the West Bank in this situation now, but despite specifically designated areas and trying to really separate the societies, they're overlapping in many ways and interconnected. What happens in Israel directly affects what happens in Palestinian communities, particularly in the West Bank, and vice versa. And still today, I had mentioned earlier that between 1967 and 1990, there was really a much more normalized integration of Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza with Israeli society, and on many levels socially. But of course, this can be seen very clearly economically. And so still today, about 10% of the labor comes from the West Bank. And so this has also really illustrated some of the problems with the restrictions and some of the dangerous conditions for Palestinian workers, as well as some of the problems also with reinfections in Israel. So Israel was, I think, the first country actually to vaccinate the vast majority of the population. Still, now they're offering fourth booster shots for people. So very organized, very quick to vaccinate the population. But the populations have been looked at and as separate and different. And meanwhile, the vaccine rates for Palestinian communities remain very low. And this is also something that was protested by many Israeli doctors, that the policy should include Palestinians within the West Bank, because otherwise the virus will mutate, the virus will spread, and it will reinfect. And this is exactly what has happened. So again, these are not new things, but the pandemic has illustrated and shown more how these types of both inequalities and interconnectedness exist between societies. So again, some of the impacts of the pandemic have been, while the populations are treated separately, they're still overlapping in many ways. And this is also something that I had written about, that I found interesting in terms of the way that places work in terms of tourism, especially in places such as Jerusalem, Bethlehem. Prior to the pandemic, there's religious pilgrimage and different forms of tourism, different types of people coming and interacting. And on many levels, both populations are overlapping with each other, interacting with each other in various spaces, although at some times Palestinians are hidden in those places, both symbolically and physically. And this is something that's been more well illustrated through the conditions of the pandemic through the last couple years. And also, this has put more stress on the institutions forcing calls for social change. And this is also not something that I'm going to argue is new or only because of the pandemic, but it's put more pressure towards the situation, particularly in terms of the Palestinian Authority and its really loss of legitimacy among most of the population, and cause for people to change it, or cause for what is very much an unsustainable situation to be changed. So what I'll move to now are some of the contemporary transitions, frustration with divisions between different segments of Palestinian society, which is not anything new. There have been growing frustrations with divisions, social divisions, class divisions, political divisions for the last 20 years. But what's happened growingly in the last 2 years is that these have reached levels that we're seeing not in political narrative any change, but on the ground, in villages, in communities, more change, more local movements, and I'm not sure if movements is even the right word to use, because they're not politically aligned, but local initiatives to replace institutions, to replace things that were funded by the PA, and focusing more on community sustainability on a local level. So there's been, especially among youth, and this is something that has been growing, but very recently displayed more rejections of the political narratives that have been repeated for years, and people trying to focus on new ways to find unity between communities that are separated from each other by focusing on local communities and sustainability. So trying to kind of reclaim, reinvent more unified identity, which is not politicized, and also more cooperation within many Palestinian communities, between more communication between communities outside, and also between some segments of Israeli society as well. And these are not really changes that we see in the narrative of the Palestinian Authority or any of the political movements or the Israeli government, but they are changes which really are growing more on local levels. And I find that more interesting. So, for example, and I think Dr. Fawzia would remember one of the things that I had researched years ago in Singapore was food security and the problems with dependence on external aid, as well as some of the what were then newer changes, agreements being signed between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and also the IMF, World Bank, to impact the local economy, local market, and how that actually, in many cases, led to higher levels of poverty, food insecurity, and problems like this. Some of the newer initiatives that are taking place in communities are looking at how to mitigate these problems. In the past, there were other movements, other initiatives to grow food, trade food, in some cases growing food secretly through different gardens hidden in different parts of cities or communities. But more and more in the last 2 years, the different restrictions on movement, antagonism from a variety of political sources, and uncertainty have increased. And in the absence of responsible authorities, these kind of grassroots initiatives have become very important. And what I want to illustrate here with this photo is one of my long-term friends who has been a very valuable source of information and inspiration for me over the years. More recently, creating initiatives in aquaponic farming. So that's using fish and to fertilize plants, which I think it's done all over the world. It's something I didn't know about until recently, and looking at this project. But this is a sustainable way of farming without using fertilizers, which cannot be imported, and using a fraction of the energy of traditional farming and water as well. So this is just one initiative which I find very impressive, which in Nablus has now started to feed more people through local farming, especially in villages and such. This photo is just one that I like to put in slides because it's one of the better photos that I have from my field work. This was probably taken 12 years ago, but he is also still very active in medical volunteer work. So that's just one example of local initiative.
Dr. Rickard, I'm so sorry. I sent you a message, and in case you lost the track, we have just under 10 minutes.
Okay.
If you want to quickly wrap up and take a couple of questions, that would be great.
Okay, that's perfect actually, because I'm just finishing up now. So I would like to close kind of on a more optimistic note, although politically it's a very messy situation. But my own interest, as I mentioned, is more in how people get by in everyday life, and some of the different initiatives that people make, also how people articulate their own sense of community and how that's changed over time. And really in the post-2000 period, it's been a very desperate situation with, especially among the young generation, quite a lot of disillusionment. And there's different reasons for that. Class divisions, increasing class divisions and lost opportunities for youth and such have been some of those reasons. But now, even despite the pandemic and all of the problems that have been exacerbated by it, there's also very impressive initiatives and people displaying more of connectedness within communities. I would say much more than 5 or 10 years ago. And again, this is not only a result of the pandemic. Things were headed in these directions anyway, particularly in terms of the loss of legitimacy of the political parties, of the elites, really of an overall rejection of the past political movements and indeed of leadership itself among a lot of the young people. But this also displays a certain optimism that I'm seeing now. People used to talk about nostalgically of the 1980s and how those were more optimistic days. But I'm now seeing that more emerging in terms of grassroots community level organization and focus more on local sustainability as well, as opposed to institution building, largely because of the failed policies that people have lived with and witnessed over the last 20 years. And people, particularly young people, wanting to really redefine identity on their own terms. And what I mean by that is not to be defined by political movements or by a certain political party or by elites, not to be defined or divided by these, which in the past, with kind of imagining Palestinian identity, which has always been something very politicized, as I mentioned earlier, from as early on as the 1960s, 70s, with the formation of political movements, and as early as 1948. People are now really wanting to look for ways to unify themselves as a community beyond fragmentation, but on their own terms, which again, I find very interesting as a change. So that's more or less, it's a collection of insights than anything else, but I'm very happy and open to any questions and to discuss these more, as well as any students particularly who want to discuss anything such as field work, anthropological methods, or more theoretically on the research questions that I had mentioned earlier.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated the fabulous background I'm sure my students were not familiar with, and the current condition, challenges that you have faced. So we have a challenge here. The time is up and I cannot keep my students further. I am sure I have a bunch of questions myself. I'm sure you have questions too. Please write your questions down. And when we meet next week, you can communicate them with me. I make an arrangement with Dr. Rickard. Either I send him the question and he gets back to me, or maybe we can have a casual meeting at some point and have Dr. Rickard for up to 20 minutes in our class. I'll see how that works because the Q&A is the most important part of it. So please write down your questions and bring them to class. I need to have at least one question from everybody. All right?
Okay, I'm sorry for going over time. I actually
That's perfectly fine.
Just when I stopped sharing screen, I saw the time it was. So
yeah, I sent you a message in the chat, but I guess you were I guess we needed to hear everything. There was nothing that you could cut here, really. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Students, thank you for joining us. Feel free to leave. I'll see you next week and we will watch a documentary together. Bring your questions to class. And other participants who I don't see them, thank you for joining us as well. I am going to stop recording now.
Thank you.